I never thought I'd be the kind of person who hires a private investigator to spy on his own family, but here I am, sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from my childhood home, looking at photographs that would make most people sick to their stomach. My name is Daniel, I'm 32 years old, and 6 months ago, I discovered that the people who raised me had been lying to me my entire adult life. Not small lies, not white lies, but the kind of lies that involve lawyers, offshore accounts, and $2.3 million that was supposed to be mine, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up here, plotting what some might call revenge and others might call justice, you need to understand where it all started. I grew up in a small town about 2 hours outside of Chicago. My father owned a chain of auto dealerships that his father had started back in the 70s. It wasn't glamorous money, but it was real money, the kind that let us live in a house with a pool and take vacations to places where the sand was white and the drinks came with little umbrellas. My mother was a homemaker, though she preferred the term domestic executive, and she spent most of her time managing the house, managing my father, and managing my younger sister Rachel. Rachel was born 3 years after me, and from the moment she entered this world, something shifted in my family's gravity. Suddenly, everything revolved around her. Her first steps were celebrated like a moon landing. Her report cards were framed and displayed. Her tantrums were treated as expressions of a creative mind rather than what they actually were, which was a spoiled child learning that screaming got her whatever she wanted. I, on the other hand, was what my parents called the easy one. I didn't cause problems. I got good grades without being asked. I made my bed, did my chores, and never complained when Rachel got the bigger piece of cake or the better Christmas presents. I thought I was being mature. I thought I was being a good son. What I was actually being was invisible, training my parents to believe they could take me for granted because I would never push back. That pattern continued well into adulthood. I went to college, studied business because I thought it would make my father proud, graduated with honors, and came back home expecting to join the family business. That was always the plan, or at least I thought it was. My father had talked about it since I was a kid, how one day I'd learn the ropes, work my way up, and eventually take over when he retired. But when I came home with my diploma and my enthusiasm, something had changed. Rachel had dropped out of college after 1 semester, claiming it wasn't for her, and somehow convinced my parents to give her a job at the dealership instead. Not just any job either. She was immediately made assistant manager at one of the flagship locations, a position that came with a company car, an expense account, and a salary that I later learned was almost double what entry-level managers typically made. When I asked my father about my own position, he got this uncomfortable look on his face and said maybe I should get some outside experience first, learn how other businesses operated before coming back to the family. I was hurt, but I didn't argue. That wasn't my style. I took a job at a consulting firm in the city, told myself it was temporary, and spent the next 5 years watching from a distance as Rachel climbed higher and higher in a company she had no business running. The thing about Rachel is that she's not stupid. She's actually quite intelligent, but in a way that serves only herself. She knows how to manipulate, how to charm, how to make people feel like they're the most important person in the room, while simultaneously using them for whatever she needs. She learned early that tears could get her out of trouble, and smiles could get her into opportunities. By the time she was 25, she was running 3 of the 6 dealerships my father owned, and everyone in the family talked about her like she was some kind of business prodigy. Nobody mentioned that sales were actually down at her locations, that employee turnover was through the roof, or that customer complaints had tripled since she took over. Those details didn't fit the narrative my parents had constructed, so they simply ignored them. I kept my head down. I built my career at the consulting firm, eventually making partner at 29, which was young even by their standards. I bought a condo in the city, started dating a woman named Michelle who worked in finance and understood my complicated relationship with my family without judging me for it. Life was good, or at least good enough. I had accepted that I would never be the favorite, that my accomplishments would always be overshadowed by Rachel's mere existence, and I had made peace with it, or so I thought. Then my grandfather died. He passed away in his sleep at 87, a peaceful end for a man who had worked hard his entire life and built something real from nothing. The funeral was held in our hometown, and for the first time in months, I saw my entire family gathered in one place. Rachel was there with her latest boyfriend, a personal trainer named Chad, who who seemed more interested in checking his reflection in windows than paying respects. My parents were somber but composed, accepting condolences and talking about how Grandpa would have wanted everyone to celebrate his life rather than mourn his death. I stood in the corner mostly, shaking hands when required, saying the right things to the right people, being invisible as always. After the service, the family gathered at my parents' house for the reading of the will. This was when everything began to unravel. I should explain something about my grandfather. He was old school in every sense of the word. He believed in hard work, in earning what you have, and in treating people fairly regardless of who they were. He also believed that men should carry on the family legacy, which was outdated and sexist by modern standards, but it was how he was raised and how he lived. Because of this belief, he had always told me, privately and repeatedly throughout my childhood, that the business would eventually be mine. Not half of it, not a share of it, but all of it. Rachel would be taken care of in other ways, he said, but the dealerships, the real wealth, the legacy he had built with his own hands, that was meant for me. I never told anyone about these conversations. I didn't want to seem entitled or create conflict, so I just held on to those words like a promise, trusting that when the time came, everything would work out the way it was supposed to. The will was read by a lawyer I'd never met before, a young guy with slick-back hair and nervous eyes. He went through the standard stuff first, smaller bequests to various relatives and charities, some personal items distributed according to Grandpa's wishes. Then he got to the main estate, which included the dealership business, several investment accounts, and a vacation property in Florida. I sat up straighter, expecting to hear my name. Instead, I heard Rachel's. Everything, the entire estate valued at approximately $4.7 million, was left to my sister Rachel, with the instruction that she use it to continue building the family business and ensure its prosperity for future generations. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there frozen, while Rachel burst into tears, dramatic and performative as always, hugging my parents and thanking Grandpa even though he wasn't there to hear it. My mother looked at me briefly, something flickering in her eyes that might have been guilt, but she quickly looked away. My father didn't look at me at all. After the reading, I confronted them. Not Rachel, she had already left with Chad to celebrate her windfall, but my parents. I found them in the kitchen, speaking in low voices, and when they saw me, they both went silent. I asked them how this could have happened, reminded them of all the conversations Grandpa and I had over the years, the promises he made. My father sighed like I was being unreasonable. Your grandfather changed his mind in his final years, he said. He saw how hard Rachel was working, how dedicated she was to the business, and he decided she was the right choice. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. Instead, I just stood there, that old familiar feeling of being the easy one settling over me like a heavy blanket. But this time, something was different. This time, beneath the hurt and the confusion, there was a small flame of something else, suspicion. The next few months were difficult. I went back to the city, threw myself into work, and tried to process what had happened. Michelle was supportive but concerned. She kept saying something didn't add up, that the grandfather I had described didn't sound like someone who would change his entire estate plan without telling anyone. She suggested I look into it, maybe hire someone to investigate, but I resisted at first. The thought of spying on my own family felt wrong, like crossing a line I couldn't come back from, but the suspicion wouldn't go away. It grew, fed by memories and inconsistencies that I couldn't stop turning over in my mind, like the fact that my grandfather had called me just 2 weeks before he died, asking when I was coming to visit, saying he had something important to discuss with me about the future. Or the fact that the lawyer who read the will was someone none of us had ever heard of, not Grandpa's longtime attorney who had handled his affairs for decades. Or the way my parents had looked at each other during the reading, a shared glance that felt less like grief and more like relief. Finally, I gave in. I hired a private investigator, a guy named Marcus who came highly recommended by a colleague who had used him during a messy divorce. Marcus was ex-law enforcement, thorough, discreet, and completely non-judgmental about the fact that I was paying him to dig into my own family's secrets. He started with the will itself, tracking down the lawyer who had read it and looking into how and when the document had been created. What he found made my blood run cold. The will that was read at my grandfather's house was not the original will. It had been created just 3 months before his death, replacing a previous document that had been in place for over 15 years. The original will, which Marcus managed to obtain a copy of through methods I didn't ask about, left everything to me, exactly as my grandfather had always promised. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the signature on the new will. My grandfather's handwriting was distinctive, a looping cursive that he'd used his entire life. The signature on the new will was close, but not quite right. The loops were too tight, the spacing too even. According to a handwriting expert Marcus consulted, there was an 83% probability that the signature was forged. I sat with that information for 3 days before I could even process it. My parents, the people who raised me, had conspired to steal my inheritance and give it to my sister. They had forged my dying grandfather's signature, created a fraudulent document, and watched me suffer at the funeral without saying a word. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that it almost didn't feel real. I kept expecting to wake up and find out it was all a nightmare, but every morning I opened my eyes to the same reality. My family had stolen $2.3 million from me, which was my half of the estate that should have been split between Rachel and me according to my grandfather's original wishes, and they had done it with smiles on their faces. Michelle was the one who talked me down from doing something stupid. I wanted to confront them immediately, to call the police, to burn their lives down in the most public way possible. But she reminded me that I was smarter than that reacting emotionally would only give them ammunition to paint me as the crazy, jealous brother. If I wanted justice, real justice, I needed to be strategic. I needed to plan. And most importantly, I needed evidence that would hold up in court, not just suspicions and expert opinions. So I waited. I kept my distance from my family, citing work obligations when they asked why I wasn't coming to holiday dinners or Sunday brunches. I watched Rachel's social media posts, tracking her spending as she burned through the inheritance on luxury cars, exotic vacations, and a renovation of her townhouse that looked like it cost more than my condo. And I kept Marcus on retainer, slowly building a case that I hoped would eventually bring everything crashing down. The breakthrough came 6 months after the funeral. Marcus had been monitoring communications, again through methods I didn't ask about, and he flagged an email chain between my mother and the lawyer who had handled the fake will. They were discussing payment, $150,000 that had been wired to an offshore account as compensation for the lawyer's services. The email included references to the original will, confirmation that it had been destroyed, and a casual mention that Grandpa had been so out of it at the end that he probably wouldn't have known the difference anyway. I read that line over and over, my hands shaking with rage. So out of it, my grandfather, a man who had built an empire with his own hands, reduced to a convenient excuse for theft. They had taken advantage of his declining health, created a fraudulent document, and stolen everything he wanted me to have. And they had done it so casually, so carelessly, like it didn't matter at all. I finally had enough. I called a lawyer, a real one this time, and laid out everything Marcus had gathered. She listened without interruption, reviewed the documents, and then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You have a strong case," she said. "Forgery, fraud, conspiracy to defraud. If this holds up, your parents could face serious criminal charges. Rachel too, if we can prove she was aware of what they did." I nodded, waiting for the but, and there it was. "But this will be ugly," she continued. "Public, drawn out, expensive. Your family will fight back and they have resources. You need to be prepared for that." I told her I was prepared. I had been preparing for 6 months. What I didn't tell her was that I had also been preparing something else, something that went beyond the legal system. Because even if I won in court, even if they went to prison and I got every dollar back, it wouldn't be enough. They had taken more than money from me. They had taken my belief in family, my trust in the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. And for that, I wanted them to feel what I had felt. I wanted them to know what it was like to be invisible, ignored, and discarded. The first phase of my plan involved Rachel's business. Despite her incompetence, or perhaps because of it, she had managed to drive 2 of the dealerships into serious financial trouble. Employee morale was at an all-time low, sales numbers were catastrophic, and there were rumors of shady practices like odometer rollbacks and misleading financing terms. I started by quietly reaching out to former employees, people who had left under bad circumstances and had no love for the family that had mistreated them. I offered to pay for legal consultations, connected them with journalists who covered business fraud, and encouraged them to tell their stories publicly. Within 2 months, local news stations were running investigative pieces on the dealerships, complete with hidden camera footage and tearful interviews with customers who had been scammed. Rachel tried to do damage control, posting videos on social media about how these were baseless attacks from jealous competitors, but the evidence was too strong. The Attorney General's office opened an investigation, and suddenly the business my grandfather had spent his life building was under a microscope. The second phase involved my parents directly. They had always been obsessed with their social standing, their reputation in the community, the way people looked at them at church and country club events. My mother especially thrived on being seen as a pillar of the community, the kind of woman who organized charity galas and received thank you notes from senators. I knew that any legal case would eventually become public, but I wanted to control the narrative from the beginning. So I created a detailed timeline of everything that had happened, from my grandfather's original promises to the forged will to the offshore payments, and I sent it anonymously to every major news outlet in the state. I included copies of the emails, the handwriting analysis, the financial records showing where the money had gone. I made it impossible to ignore. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. I was at work when my phone started blowing up with notifications. My parents' faces were on the local news, then the regional news, then somehow CNN picked it up as part of a larger segment on inheritance fraud. The headline read Local Business Dynasty Accused of Elder Abuse and Forgery. Elder abuse. I hadn't even thought of it in those terms, but of course that's what it was. They had manipulated a sick old man, used his deteriorating condition to steal from him and from me. By the end of the day, my parents had released a statement through their lawyer, calling the accusations defamatory and promising to pursue legal action against whoever was responsible for spreading these lies. Rachel posted a crying video, her specialty, talking about how her family was being targeted by someone with a vendetta. She even implied it might be me, though she didn't say my name directly. The comments on her posts were brutal. People called her a thief, a fraud, a disgrace. Her follower count, which she had always been so proud of, dropped by 10,000 in a single week. I watched all of this from a distance, feeling something I can only describe as cold satisfaction. Not joy exactly, because there was too much pain mixed in, but a sense that justice was finally being served, that the people who had made me feel worthless for 32 years were finally experiencing consequences. But I wasn't done yet. The legal case moved forward. My lawyer filed a civil suit seeking recovery of the stolen inheritance plus damages for emotional distress and fraud. At the same time, the district attorney's office began a criminal investigation based on the evidence we had provided. My parents tried to settle quietly, offering to return the money if I would drop the charges and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I refused. They offered more $2 million than $3 million, then finally the full amount plus an additional $500,000 for my trouble. I refused every time. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about accountability. The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring. In the months leading up to it, my family fell apart in ways I never could have predicted. My father had a heart attack, minor but serious enough to require surgery and extended bed rest. My mother, unable to cope with the public humiliation, started drinking heavily and had to be hospitalized after a particularly bad episode. Rachel's boyfriend Chad left her, presumably because associating with a fraud suspect wasn't good for his personal brand. And the dealerships, the business my grandfather had built over 50 years, were forced into bankruptcy after the Attorney General's investigation uncovered years of illegal practices that went far beyond what I had even known about. Everything they had stolen from me and everyone else, crumbled to dust. I wish I could say I felt triumphant watching their downfall. I wish I could say it healed all the wounds they had inflicted over the years, but the truth is more complicated. There were moments of satisfaction, absolutely, like when I saw my father being led into the courthouse in handcuffs, or when Rachel's mug shot made the front page of the newspaper she used to brag about being featured in. But there was also grief. Grief for the family I thought I had, grief for the relationship with my parents that could never be repaired, grief for the grandfather who died not knowing that his final wishes would be violated by the people he trusted most. The trial lasted 3 weeks. My parents both pleaded guilty to forgery and fraud, likely to avoid worse charges and to spare themselves the humiliation of a full public airing of their crimes. Rachel claimed she had no knowledge of the forged will, and while I didn't believe her for a second, the prosecution couldn't prove otherwise, so she was not charged criminally. She was, however, ordered to return her portion of the estate as part of the civil settlement, which left her essentially broke and forced to start her life over from nothing. My father was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, though he would likely serve less with good behavior. My mother received 18 months of probation and community service due to her health issues and lack of prior criminal record. The lawyer who had helped them was disbarred and also faced charges, though I didn't follow his case closely. And I, after everything was settled, received a check for $2.7 million, which included the original inheritance plus damages and interest. I donated $500,000 of it to elder abuse prevention organizations in my grandfather's name. The rest I invested, planning to use it to build something of my own someday, something that had nothing to do with dealerships or family businesses or the legacy that had been fought over and destroyed. Michelle and I got engaged 6 months after the trial ended. We bought a house in a different state, somewhere warm with good schools and no connection to my past. I started therapy, which I probably should have done years earlier, and began the long process of understanding why I had spent so much of my life accepting treatment that I never deserved. The easy one, the invisible one, the one who didn't cause problems. I used to think those labels were compliments. Now I know they were just excuses my family used to justify ignoring me while they focused on the sibling they actually cared about. I don't talk to any of them anymore. Not my parents, not Rachel, not the extended relatives who sided with them or stayed neutral during the trial. Some people think that's cold, unforgiving, that family should stick together no matter what, but I disagree. Family isn't just about blood. It's about trust, respect, and treating each other with basic human decency. The people who share my DNA violated all of those principles in the worst possible way. They stole from me, lied to me, and watched me suffer without a shred of remorse. Forgiving them wouldn't be noble. It would be giving them permission to keep hurting me. Sometimes, I wonder what my grandfather would think if he could see how everything turned out. I like to believe he would be proud of me for fighting back, for refusing to accept the injustice that was done in his name. He always said that a man's word was his bond, that promises meant something, that you should never let anyone take what you had earned. His children, my parents, forgot those lessons somewhere along the way. They got greedy, got comfortable, and thought they could get away with anything because they always had before. They were wrong. I got a letter from my mother a few weeks ago. It arrived at my old address, forwarded by a friend who still lives in the building. The envelope was handwritten, her familiar looping script that I used to associate with birthday cards and grocery lists. I held it for a long time before deciding what to do with it. Part of me wanted to read it, to know what excuses she had constructed, what version of events she had convinced herself was true, but a bigger part of me knew it didn't matter. Nothing she could say would undo what had been done. No words could rebuild the bridge they had burned so thoroughly, so I threw it away unopened and went on with my day. The thing about revenge is that people warn you it's empty, that it won't fill the void or heal the pain. And maybe that's true to some extent. Getting my money back and watching my family face consequences didn't magically make me whole. I still have days when the anger resurfaces, when I think about everything I lost and everything that was stolen from me. But here's what those people don't tell you about revenge. Sometimes it's not about feeling better. Sometimes it's about proving to yourself that you matter, that you're not the invisible, disposable person they tried to make you believe you were. I spent 32 years being the one who didn't cause problems. Now I know that some problems deserve to be caused, some fires deserve to be set. And some people deserve to watch everything they built burn down around them, while the person they underestimated walks away with everything they tried to steal. My grandfather built his business from nothing. He started with one used car lot and a dream, worked 18-hour days for decades, and created something that should have lasted for generations. My parents and sister destroyed all of that with their greed and their lies, but his real legacy wasn't the dealerships or the money. It was the values he tried to pass on, the belief that hard work matters and that people should be treated fairly. I carry those values with me now, not because I'm obligated to, but because I choose to. I choose to be the person he believed I could be, even when everyone else in my family gave up on that vision a long time ago. Michelle and I are expecting our first child in the spring, a boy, according to the ultrasound. We've already decided to name him after my grandfather, a tribute to the man who saw something in me that my parents never did. I think about the kind of father I want to be, the mistakes I want to avoid, the patterns I refuse to repeat. My son will never have to wonder if he matters. He will never feel invisible in his own home. He will never be made to feel like the easy one, the one who can be taken for granted because he doesn't fight back. I will teach him that standing up for yourself isn't causing problems, it's having self-respect. and I will make sure he knows every single day that he is loved unconditionally, not for what he can provide or how little trouble he causes, but simply for who he is. The last time I visited my grandfather's grave was on the anniversary of his death. I brought flowers, the yellow roses he always liked, and I sat there for almost an hour, talking to him like he could hear me. I told him what had happened, how his will had been forged, how his son and daughter-in-law had betrayed everything he stood for. I told him about the trial, the conviction, the justice that had finally been served. And I told him I was sorry, sorry that I hadn't been there at the end, sorry that I hadn't protected him from the people who should have protected him. The wind picked up while I was talking, rustling through the trees around the cemetery, and for just a moment I let myself believe it was him answering, telling me it was okay, that he was proud of me, that everything would be all right now. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that, but I believe in the power of memory, in the way the people we lose stay with us through the choices we make and the values we uphold. My grandfather is gone, but his influence lives on in me, in my future son, in the life I'm building with Michelle. That's his real legacy, not money or business or material things that can be stolen or destroyed. It's the invisible thread that connects us to the people who mattered, who saw us clearly when no one else could. I used to think that being the easy one was my role, my identity, something unchangeable like my height or my eye color, but identities can shift. Roles can be rejected, and the people who tried to define you don't get the final word unless you let them. My family tried to make me small. They tried to keep me in a box so they could ignore me more easily. They tried to take everything I was owed and expected me to accept it silently because that's what I had always done, but they forgot something important. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Easy doesn't mean pushover. And the person who never causes problems is often the most dangerous one of all when you finally give them a reason to fight. I don't regret what I did. Not the investigation, not the leaked documents, not the trial or the sentences or any of it. My parents had 32 years to treat me with respect, and they chose not to. Rachel had 32 years to be a sister instead of a rival, and she chose not to. They made their choices, and then they made the choice to steal from me, to lie to me, to use my own grandfather's death as an opportunity for greed. Every consequence they faced was earned. Every bit of suffering was justified. And every night when I go to sleep in my new house with my pregnant fiancée and my future stretching out before me, I feel nothing but peace. Some stories don't have happy endings, but this one does. Not because everything is perfect, not because the pain has completely healed, but because I finally broke free from the cycle that had trapped me my entire life. I am not the easy one anymore. I am not the invisible one. I am not the person who accepts whatever crumbs his family deigns to throw him. I am someone who knows his worth, who fights for what he deserves, and who never, ever lets anyone make him feel small again. And that transformation, that awakening, that fundamental shift in how I see myself and my place in the world, that is worth more than any inheritance could ever be. My grandfather's name was Joseph. He came to this country with nothing, built everything through determination and hard work, and died believing his wishes would be respected. They weren't. But I like to think that wherever he is, he can see what I've become, the man who didn't let injustice stand, who fought for what was right, who honored his memory by refusing to be a victim. I am his grandson, his real legacy, and I will carry that proudly for the rest of my life. The people who tried to steal that from me are left with nothing but regret and consequences. And I, the one they dismissed and overlooked and underestimated for so long, I got everything. Not just the money, not just the justice, but something far more valuable. I got my freedom, I got my dignity, I got my future. And I got the satisfaction of knowing that in the end, the quiet one won.